how these icons get created. And I think sneakers are the perfect example. Jordan's probably being like an order of magnitude more, like the power laws in that chart is probably Jordan 1's at the very top. And, Nike's probably got the next couple there too. And in crypto art, I think that's true too. There's a couple of standout projects that have just hit that power law, Squiggles being one of them. Punk's probably up there fighting for top spot too, where you have this very simple constraint on the face of it. Like you can look at the silhouette of either of those things without color at any scale and any frame size, and you know what it is.
The SquiggleDAO podcast is brought to you by Niftify. If you need liquidity, instead of selling your NFT, you can get a loan. Niftify is the most battle-tested and secure NFT lending protocol. You can borrow ETH, USDC, or DAI from lenders using your NFTs as collateral in a trustless peer-to-peer fashion. By being peer-to-peer, you can get better terms on specific or rare NFTs. And there is no liquidation risk. As long as you repay the loan before maturity, your NFT is yours. Head over to niftify.com and access the app today.
Welcome to the SquiggleDAO podcast. My name is Jared, and online you can find me as Jared_Paz. I'm the founder of the 8NAP Digital Asset Fund, the art platform 8NAP Art, and I'm excited to chat marketing and Web3 with today's guest.
And I'm Nifty. I lead finance, acquisitions, and NFT DeFi for the DAO, and I'm another huge fan of Squiggles. Our guest today is Jack Butcher. Jack is an artist, a graphic designer, and an entrepreneur. He has built the brand Visual is Value, where he uses minimalistic design to educate and share ideas that resonate. He also created really interesting NFT projects. Amongst those are Checks and Opepen. Previously, he worked as a graphic designer for 15 years in UK and New York City. And currently, he's one of the leading network tag artists and one of the most followed designers and marketers online. It's an honor to have him with us today. Jack, welcome to the pod.
Thank you for having me, gents. Appreciate it.
Well, I have to say, despite the three-piece suit on right now, I'm a huge sneakerhead in my private life. And during our research, I think I spotted you wearing a pair of Travis Scott ones during your NFT Now interview with AC of the 6529 fund. And I think in the background, you had a pair of off-white Air Force One mids.
Yeah, I don't know if they're in the narrow shot here, but that's right, yeah.
To me, sneakers is culture these days, and your art, especially Checks, is, I think, a comment on culture at the time that it was released. How do you view creating longevity in culture with your art, like the Air Jordan 1 or the Air Force One has done over the years?
Oh, great question. So obviously I think it's undisputed that the Jordan 1 is like the most iconic silhouette to have ever been created in that category. And I think it's actually a great template for how to think about building something that has this lasting power and influence and can take on so many different iterations of itself while still remaining kind of true to its original form. And I think I picked a lot of that up back in my commercial design work days, where you're working within these constraints. And for somebody or a team of people to create an object that can kind of absorb these different inputs from culture while remaining like very true to itself still, that's like how these icons get created. And I think sneakers are the perfect example. Jordan's probably being like an order of magnitude more, like the power laws in that chart is probably Jordan 1's at the very top, and Nike's probably got the next couple there too. And in crypto art, I think that's true too. There's a couple of standout projects that have just hit that power law, Squiggles being one of them. Punk's probably up there fighting for top spot too, where you have this very simple constraint on the face of it. Like you can look at the silhouette of either of those things without color at any scale and any frame size, and you know what it is. And then they also have this quality where they can be remixed or added to or reinterpreted in so many different ways, and kind of continue to add equity to the original project, like cultural equity to the original project. Like obviously Travis Scott example is a artist of the moment giving their take on this thing that has been foundation of culture for decades and decades. And then in 10 years' time, you can imagine whoever the Travis Scott of that moment is will aspire to create a Jordan 1 just because of to continue that lineage. So, I think subconsciously absorbed a lot of that from that world, but only really recently got into the intellectual deconstruction of something like that. Just before it's just like, oh, these are cool, I want them. But when you think about it in the context of all of these different things working together, definitely so much to learn from that world.
Well, I mean, I think that you talk about it on the Proof podcast with Sam about the checks being 8x10 grid, and in a fashion that allowed for that scalability and the user input and the customization. It was, I will say in hindsight, from my perspective, is absolute genius.
I appreciate that. Yeah, I think the constraint has just been a theme in so much of the things that have ever clicked or ever managed to get some momentum. Is the paradox of having something so rigid that it creates all this energy because it's just so focused, and if you really, really lower the barrier of entry for somebody to remix or contribute to something, obviously you get more contributions. And you can make the argument that the average contribution is not as curated as it might be if you hand-picked certain things. But on a open network, these things just tend to like fight for they find their place in the hierarchy naturally as a function of just being put out into the network. So that just watching that play out, and the real catalyst for that is just the constraint that's easy to remix, and then the permission for people to just go nuts and do whatever they want to reinterpret that thing.
You've talked a lot about constraints. I remember visualized value being like black and white, no images, just one typeface. Also, you've mentioned that if someone wants to get traction online, just pick a constraint and do it 100 times. What's your mental process to simplify a complex topic into an image or into a graphic?
So that the black and white constraint for visualized value was originally, there was a couple reasons I picked that. I think one was a pure contrast decision. So if you're scrolling through Instagram and you see these like hyper saturated lifestyle photos, the typical content that you see on Instagram, and then you're like confronted with this black square with like 50 white pixels on it. One of the initial decisions was that, just to interrupt the feed and kind of be a pattern interrupt, scrolling down these like high saturation photos typically. And then the second was trying to actually strip out a lot of the style, or like having this be able to absorb all different types of ideas from all different types of people. Like you want to make it kind of stylistically neutral in order to do that, almost like using a typewriter to write something. You have this very, very stripped back set of ingredients that you use. And then to the original question, the idea of how you take an idea and turn it into something visual, it's almost like turning it into an equation of sorts. So you read the language, and then hard to describe the process, but you can kind of separate it into these logical parts in a lot of cases. Or there are things like contrasting ideas in a sentence that will, try and create emphasis on a point, and that translates really well to visual. So you can play with things like contrast or scale, or these patterns actually that we all kind of understand to mean certain things, like an arrow, right? It's like the most understood, this set of symbols that transcend languages, that you don't need to necessarily read the quote in its native language to understand it. And one of the things that actually clicked further on down the journey in visualized value was kind of put this constraint on the idea where if I didn't put text on the image, and you just rely on basically Instagram's ability to translate the quote underneath, does that thing still map when you translate through different languages? So you really, really, really put the emphasis on the visual doing the communication, or at least adding context to the idea itself. And the final thing on that, like how I kind of stress tested those ideas. I was always look at it from like, what is the worst way that somebody could interpret this? Like, what is the least charitable way that somebody would look at this and like attack this idea? And that often just helps, just going through that feedback loop of feeling as though you can defend it from every angle that you can possibly think of. That's like the green light to post it. And that's mostly I do get back into that a little bit now, but I was doing that just so frequently where I was putting like 5 or 6 out a day years and years ago. And they were all ideas that were helping me navigate some transition of my own at the time. So there were always like this personal feedback loop involved too.
I was going to ask, because the checks seem to have just taken off. I mean, and really launched almost to like a meteoric rise, which is exciting to watch in the space. But do you feel like your intuition and reps from early marketing days helped you maybe streamline this process? Because I feel like in the space, everybody's looking for that one thing, and you just came onto things and really created that sticky moment, which so many people I think strive for, but you seem to just naturally have found that cadence.
I think definitely the repetition of just working in that social environment for so long, like the visualized value, that began as an agency business, like a service business, basically. So it was like this very unsexy, like doing pitch decks for logistics companies and hedge funds and things like, it's like super dry material. And I was using it as a creative outlet on Instagram and Twitter as a way to try and communicate that skill set of being able to simplify and visualize ideas, but not just post, slides from these pitch decks I was working on. So it was kind of a lead generation tool originally to get conversations going with people that needed that done as a service. And then it just eventually hit a point where there was more demand that I could keep up with on the service side. So I had to think about how to modify the business to respond to that demand. So there was a set of products that came after that. And then after building products for a couple of years, I built this group of a couple thousand people that were interested in using this discipline of visualizing value. And that's actually how I came into this world. People were telling me like, hey, there's this entire digital art scene that's exploding, and you've been publishing digital art for this long. And, this, in a way, it still served the same function. It was kind of this thing that was there to get attention to something else, as opposed to it just being the thing that you produce, if that makes sense. Like it was like art as a marketing exercise versus art as art.
This is the perfect transition, because in your proof interview, you mentioned NFTs were perceived by a lot of people around you as just JPEGs, right? And then you go on to mention how your art really existed on Instagram, Twitter, and then I think even comedically you say like your hard drive or your Google Drive, right? And you compared this to like a 56K dial-up modem, and I thought that was the perfect analogy, because to me it felt like when you look back on it, it just felt somewhat barbaric, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like I can still hear the AOL dial-up sound in my head. But then you describe buying your first NFT as a transformative moment, and you notice how things became immutable and almost, when on chain, it becomes permanent, right? So this is really exciting to hear somebody from like maybe more of that traditional world transition into the digital art space and just the impermanence of that. What did discovering the blockchain do for you, and what does that mean for like future generations, in your opinion?
Well, I think it is this, the fundamental philosophical difference between renting a network and owning a network. and this idea of Instagram having complete monopoly over the social graph that you've created or the social graph that you're a part of, right? And that idea did not immediately click for me, but it was definitely where I started to explore, in the same way that the material I was producing prior to discovering this was all about the transition from the service business I was running, to doing something really specific on the internet at scale where you can just stay in your zone of genius constantly. The transition from renting a network to owning a network, it didn't really become obvious until actually last year. So I really understood at a fundamental level why digital provenance is important, and having this neutral way to preserve the work that you're creating. I had my Twitter account banned at one point, and just everything just like went into the abyss. So I instantly understood it from a provenance perspective. And I think it's not until you have critical mass in a network of sorts. So, when you have a dozen pieces of work out in the world, you have one realization about why this technology is interesting. Then when you have 10,000 pieces, it's a very, very different environment that you've entered into, and very different set of second order effects that exist around those 10,000 different nodes, let's call them, in a network, which ironically, visualized value kind of if I'd have had access to this earlier on, I think the second and third order effects of creating that stuff, to your question about what impact does it have in the future, it just connects the right people way earlier than it would if you had to basically go from this top-down system where the person that's consuming this idea is not necessarily aware of the other person that's consuming this idea, because the signals they're both sending are way weaker than I expended some economic energy on this, or I have a provable social graph that even I've been thinking about this recently, and this is not a fully fleshed out thought, but having that around the library of visualized value images, for example, would create such an interesting set of second order effects and network effects beyond one person being able to own a single image, which is very cool and interesting. But I think the longer term interesting side effects of this stuff is way more about connectivity and the second order effects of those connections that are, it's really hard to, I think it's hard to articulate taste, right? And these images become these magnets for taste, and these ways to connect people that almost cannot describe what it is they appreciate about these things. If you ask them to like sit down and articulate what type of people you're trying to meet, what are you interested in, all of that, versus these objects that become these like meeting places for people who have similar ideas, tastes, maybe like complementary ideas coming at it from different angles. So I think that to me is the long-term promise, is everything that comes from the ability to gather people around an object that means something significant to those people.
I like the renting versus owning, and I remind me of Tim Ferriss always says it's like owning the most profitable McDonald's on a top of a volcano, where any day it can go away. So I love that parallel. Visualized Value has minted a few collections we've mentioned before: Opepen, Checks, also the recent projects with Red Bull, Ordinals, and some open editions. We were chatting before, the process for the trademark and the signature with Red Bull that you mentioned before, that you wrote all the code with ChatGPT. What was the process and the idea behind that?
Yeah, so when they reached out originally, I believe they'd already decided they want to use Artblock's engine. And obviously, I'm a huge fan of Artblocks and Eric. and I hadn't had any interaction with it besides collecting work. And that to me was incredibly interesting. And I've had a barrier to learning a lot of those things for a long time. Like when you have I guess trying to identify the best use of your time, for me, like going back to first principles development and learning from scratch from YouTube videos and textbooks and things that, like, I just never thought that was I would be able to make time for that. And then having played around with ChatGPT and P5 specifically, the JavaScript library, like in a couple of days, I went from 0 to 1, being able to figure out how to render an image with these constraints. And it's like, I did not come up with this description, but it's English is a programming language, right? If you can be articulate enough to describe to a machine what to do, you're programming in the same way that you're writing line by line, the really specific stuff. And the code itself, it's a really interesting process, like being in conversation with the algorithm that you're creating, right? And this idea of constraints, throwing randomness at constraints, is really, to me, what generative art is. You create these constraints, and then you specifically, art blocks allows you to generate the most random hashes you possibly can and create these outputs in response to those. So I'd always been in this world of, like, even back in my commercial design days, you're trying to design systems that guide certain inputs. Like even if you're designing a massive application or website or whatever it is, you have to think through every possible interaction or use case with this thing. And conceptually, the Red Bull stuff, I've been a huge like car guy my whole life, and the opportunity to do something that represents some of those ideas. And I think even I haven't done a thorough job of explaining some of the ideas in those collections, but trademark specifically, this idea of, I think there's such a parallel to what's going on in the world that we occupy now, where these intangible properties can be owned. Like the fact that we as a civilization have agreed that Red Bull owns those two words and can build companies and hire people around those ideas, and can use that tension to create this machine that competes around the world. Like the registered trademark symbol is almost like an early version of the NFT, right? It's this idea that you can attribute ownership to something intangible, and that makes this cooperation and competition and all of these things possible. So it was important, I think, for me also to work within these systems that allow me to do it by myself. And I'm just scratching the surface, honestly, on what's possible there. It's absolutely remarkable process. How it's also hard to stop when you're in that environment, where you, like, when do you decide that this is done? And that is I think it was what is it, one of the Renaissance characters, maybe it was Da Vinci, is like, art is never finished, only abandoned. And that's definitely the case in these algorithmic outputs, because obviously you have to give up some agency to randomness at the end of that. And it's a very different way of thinking. I actually had this thought, and you guys might have an example of this, but this idea that the algorithm itself could be the single NFT, or the single point of ownership, and every output that it creates is just a way of it propagating itself. But the ownership of this thing this is actually like another thing that I've been, this analogy of punks, for example, being a single portrait. If you think of punks as a single portrait, then it is the most expensive portrait in the world. It just happens to be ownable by 10,000 people who can express their ownership in a unique visual way. And I think that analogy is also like an interesting way to think about the tension that digital artists have around supply too. When you say, you know, somebody has 100,000 pieces of work out there, it's probably more likely they have 5 pieces of work that happen to, you know, be fractionalized in certain ways. And I think they're very delicate discussions right now, obviously, because this is an emerging field and you have to balance market realities with what you're doing, of course. But I think over time that perception will change where, you know, you could think of squiggles as a single piece of work as opposed to 10,000 pieces of work.
Being the algorithm being the art and people just collecting that algorithm makes total sense. Talking about your recent collections on ordinals, recent, but it was inscribed in February 2023 below the 20,000 inscription. And you've talked a lot about constraints. Different blockchains have different limitations, also create different opportunities. What difference do you see and opportunities do you see as an artist, as as a collector for Bitcoin, Ethereum, and maybe others?
Mm-hmm. I think the Bitcoin thing, the real stark contrast is Ethereum as a computer and Bitcoin as a ledger, right? The most secures the most value in the world, like in the crypto world. Bitcoin secures the most value. Therefore, you know, you can make the analogy like the hardest assets live there, right? And this idea that there is true to the degree that we have reached consensus on Bitcoin being around for a long time. There is I would argue there's like more of an argument for immutability there and just the way it functions, right? The file is inscribed, which is a different process than, say, pointing to a image that is hosted on a decentralized service, which there are different degrees of immutability on Ethereum, and there are works that can be compared to like the most immutable stuff on Bitcoin, just depending on how it's implemented. But the other thing that was interesting to me about ordinal specifically was the simplicity or the simplicity of the numeric system, you know, which is very different than Ethereum too. Like you can attribute the date of deployment to a smart contract on Ethereum. You can date everything there. There's no debate about that, but it doesn't have the very monkey brain. This is number 1. This is number 55 million, and this piece was inscribed at this interval. And I think one of the definitions that we've been like kicking around about what these things are is they're time machines. You know, a blockchain is a time machine, and different blockchains allow you to interface with like their records of time in different ways. And some of them are very simple interactions where like I own this time capsule on the time machine, and on Ethereum it's I have the ability to, you know, exert some agency over that. I can change this thing, I can have some input, and but overall they're all performing this function of just keeping a record of what happened. And my response to that back in February last year, a good friend of mine who does a lot of work on Bitcoin just reached out to me and was like, hey, this thing might not be a thing. It's like, it's a very like, it's a huge breakthrough in the Bitcoin culture and community. If you're interested in doing something, you should do it. And at the time, the development of checks was like halfway done on Ethereum. So it's just as a, you know, sticking to that thesis of the time at which something is done is important, and, you know, just documenting what you're thinking about at that point in time, and that being as much of a part of the idea that you're putting out there as the visual itself, just felt like something that had to be done at that moment in time. And a year later, only did it become did the context build up when there's 55 million inscriptions ahead of it. So I think there's something just fundamentally interesting about that, based on the way we've chosen to index it and think about it as a group of people.
And to give people an idea of how early sub 20,000 is the era where people were trading using the spreadsheet, right? The OTC.
Yeah. So like to get them on there, it was like this insanely delicate process of like manually using miners to inscribe these things. It was like there's no interface to put them up. So yeah, it was at the decision in my head at that point in time was like, this is either going to be super interesting or nobody will ever think about it again. So it was an easy decision to make at the time.
Those are the best opportunities, definitely.
Yeah.
Say welcome to blockchain.
Yeah, exactly true. Yeah.
One of my favorite collaborations from your and Snowfro point of view is the Snowpepen. I also love how the description says some light the fuse, some carry the torch, in reference to Snowfro's bio, giving a shout out to Larva Labs for lighting the fuse. And how was the process to create a piece that mixes so well the squiggles and the Opepen style?
So the Opepen thing, just to give context to that, like the silhouette of Opepen and the project in general was a kind of a response to the PFP mania, right? As an artist that's practicing in this world, that there is some allure to the most popular, let's say in inverted commas, real estate for your work to be displayed. And before Opepen, I'd kicked around the idea of like, what could be done there that's interesting and different and isn't 10,000 slight variations on the same thing. And Opepen came as an iteration on an open edition that had no, intent to be anything specific at all. And made a couple of decisions to just split it into these parcels, basically of 80 tokens at a time. It's 16,000 tokens total, so it'll be 200 releases. And the idea being the symbol, very similar to the checks thesis, the symbol should be recognizable enough that you can give it to any artist in the world and they can interpret it. You'll still know that it's attached to that project, but it's very much their DNA. So I've gotten to know Eric over the last couple of years, and we've always been like, oh, if there's a time to do something, like it will just present itself at a certain point, right? It's like, let's just wait and see. And this, I remember just thinking of that silhouette one day, the taking the obvious organic silhouette of the squiggle and giving it slightly more structure so it mirrors that the structure of the Opepen, and sent that over. And I mean, you guys have spoken to Eric, just incredible level of support for doing it. It's just like, yeah, it looks great. Let's do it. And also shout out to Jalil on the technical side, who took the squiggle code and one-to-one mapped it to the traits within the Opepen. So you have the all the specificity and the actual code that Eric wrote informing the color spectrums on every single one of those tokens. And yeah, it's just an incredible honor to be able to do that. And Eric wrote this just unbelievable summary of it after the fact. And it's just can't really, like, from back a couple years ago, just honestly, just a huge admirer of everything that Eric and Artblocks have accomplished, to be able to do something collaborative that feels like feels different and interesting, and not just a net new collection is a huge honor.
Now, correct me if I'm wrong, but it was one of the more subscribed to raffles out of
I believe
all the
it is.
Opepens.
Yeah. The opt-in was 11,000% or something.
It was off the charts. It was like a snowball's chance in hell of actually getting one. But kudos to those who did. The thing I liked about the collection too, or the Opepen that is I think it's scaled not only color for color, but also I think it scaled with the intent of shapes, right? Because you did a really great job of integrating. There's a hyper one hyper out of the 80, which is incredible. but also like the slinkies and different colors. So, or the different types of squiggle. So anybody who's not familiar with it, I actually have an open tab where I constantly check the listings because I'm hoping to snipe one of these days. But
Nice.
you can just go to the Opepen collection and sort by artist, I believe.
Yeah.
It's really honestly, like I love the slinky as a squiggle, but I have to say I actually think I like the slinky more because of the Opepen. It was
That's
just
very cool.
so brilliantly executed, and some of the colors that it maps is just it's stunning, in my opinion. Ideally, I'd like the hyper, but I don't know. It's a little bit outside my budget
Yeah,
right
it's a
now.
little, and they all also follow all the animation script from the original code too. So if you go on OpenSea and click on them, they'll move.
That's really cool. So you obviously worked closely with Eric on that. What is the first word that comes to mind to describe Eric?
Just, I think generous is probably the first one. Just like it's very odd to practice basically your entire work on the internet, and you kind of build up pictures and imaginary personalities around people that have accomplished things that you haven't accomplished. And just there's people that you admire and you meet them in person, and oftentimes you're completely off. And I was off about Eric in all the right ways, I guess, like for what he's accomplished. And I was just incredible guy, unbelievable. And everybody that meets him is just amazing dude. And not really, it's hard to actually, I met him at an event once, and he had the printer printing out and signing the squiggles, which I think is a perfect encapsulation of generosity. And he's in it for all the right reasons and fighting for all the principles that I think are actually necessary if this thing becomes I think hope it becomes. And to have somebody that has created things that are so iconic have those beliefs and push those ideas forward, I think that that's kind of a chicken and egg scenario. I think he's in the position that he's in because of those ideals, but at the same time, we're very lucky to have people in those positions with those traits.
100%. Okay, we have a few minutes left. Let's jump into a rapid fire section. The questions are rapid fire, answers don't need to be. So as long as you want. You have a really cool punk, really clean, couple of squiggles, cryptodes, mibits, any grail that got away and the story behind it?
Man, there's a lot. There are squiggles that I wish I'd have punks and squiggles, basically the extent of that list, like in 2021 probably. And there's a lot of one work that I was just completely out of my reach over the years, but I'm very happy with the one punk. Do it for the network effects, one punk is enough for me. And the squiggle that Eric kindly gifted me late last year, that will be that's the ultimate grail.
Those are forever pieces. I had the fortune to mint one, and I see those as forever.
Yeah, incredible. That was when did Squiggles mint? It was a couple
November.
years.
It started minting November 2020. They stopped minting February 2021.
Yeah, before my time.
Besides the Basquiat skateboards that you have on your background, what other pieces of art, digital or non-NFTs, do you have on your walls?
So almost everything I have is, I would say 50% of it is digital first. I have a squiggle downstairs, a couple of screen prints, Paul Rand, like graphic design, like there's a couple of typographic screen prints of his I have downstairs. And there's a guy called Piv, if you guys are familiar with this guy. He has a collection called Punkism, and he's actually a perfect example of a lot of the things that we've talked about, where he uses the punks as a constraint to create these. I mean, I don't even know if you can call them derivatives. They're just. I have a piece downstairs. It's called Rembrandt Punk, and he's basically taken the Rembrandt lighting style and applied it to the 24 by 24 grid. There's a punk sitting behind it, and I have a couple of those printed out downstairs. What else is down there? And I got a couple checks printed up from early on. But the walls are bare in here compared to the computer screen for sure. And trying to close that gap is, I don't know. The criteria is so different. I think like the stuff that the Squiggle, I think like they're great. They're incredible conversation starters, those too. When you have people in your house, they're so, I think, different from what people expect to see hanging on a wall, and the conversations that they can start are so much more nuanced and interesting than a traditional piece of art. From my perspective, I just have more to say about it, so that's why it's hung up there.
That being said, it's really easy to red pill people once they see a Squiggle. It's like so friendly and relatable, but yet like the layers of complexity are hidden. It's incredible. I use it too. I have an infinite object on my desk that I stare at every day, and not only do my kids love it, but all the way up to my grandmother.
Yeah, incredible. Yeah. I think that's a great way to describe it, is the layers of it, and to create something that can be appreciated at every level of interaction. That is an insanely difficult thing to accomplish. And yeah, I just actually have a funny litmus test now with my 2-year-old, where a kid just has no barrier between like, I like that or I don't like it, and they'll just say it to you. I'll be working on something, I'll just turn the screen on and go, no good. And they have like a visceral reaction to the composition of something. And yeah, I've just found that so fascinating, like color, shape, and yeah, they love the Squiggles, the kids. So that's a good barometer.
Great. No matter how much they cost, no matter anything.
Right. Fascinating, man. Just pure instinctual response to a visual is hard to come by, especially where we're operating. It's like the context changes things.
Checks had 16. It's incredible stat. 16 times more mints than likes in the post. What, like something pretty revealing? What are some lessons that you've learned from this time working on NFTs?
Well, that whole idea of like economic energy being more representative of intention than like cheap social signals is something that I'd been exploring long before NFTs. It's like if you're trying to like pay attention to what somebody does, not what they say, if you're trying to understand like what is likely to happen in the future, those are the things that you should be paying attention to. And outside of all the constraint stuff, which I think was a response to work I'd already been doing, I think the amount of transparency into the process was very influential in the result, and the idea of trying to provide as much context as possible while these things were happening and recording your thought process during that time. There's actually things that I regret from that point in time, where so much more of that process should have been preserved in the same way that the collection itself was preserved. And I think we're getting closer to that as a culture, where minting is not necessarily just a device to market and sell things, right? It's like, first and foremost, it is a tool for recording provenance, and then over time, those objects can do different things. Maybe they never move, but the lost context to being to thinking about minting just as a commercial activity, that's one of my biggest regrets, honestly. So in hindsight, and even trying to fix that now is really difficult, and trying to encourage that across like people interacting with everything that VV puts out that's one of the bigger missions. And I know I've had conversations with Eric about this. I'm sure I want to speak for him, but I think a lot of the conversations we've had lately are talking about these ideas of scarcity and the context of scarcity across all these different collections that you might put out, and understanding that you can have nuance in the context in which the work is presented. Like, for example, there are infinite editions that Eric put out, and there are squiggles, and the two things have completely different contexts and worlds built around them. And for this entire space to mature, trusting people to understand that context is basically a requirement at this point. For it to grow beyond 10,000 or 5,000 people interacting with one another, it has to like cross the Rubicon of this is just how we treat working on the internet, as opposed to everything is a hyper scarce activity that requires injections of attention every week to be valuable. Good friend of mine has this quote. He said, provenance is not about the past, it's about the future. So like these things gain their meaning in the space between their creation and mint and, time accruing into the future, which I think the thesis of Checks all really revolves around this idea too, is this is representative of a fundamental shift in internet culture from, this being a top down, you are assigned a check mark because you are notable as deemed by the Washington Post or whoever, versus 200,000 nodes in this network decide to give economic support to this piece of work that you just put out. And that, I think, that idea transcends just what we're doing in the digital art world, right? It's more about the freedom to transact and distribute ideas and own these ephemeral objects. So
if there's anybody who can change that culture, my bet would be on Jack Butcher. You definitely see things in a very progressive fashion.
That.
And you remind me of the Wayne Gretzky quote of, you don't skate to where the puck is, you skate to where it's going to be. And just even listening to you, I have a strong suspicion you're already skating to where it's going.
Well, thank you.
Speaking of that, last rapid fire here is, how do you define success, and has that changed over time for you at all?
Man, it's very simply is wanting to get out of bed in the morning. I think that's for me over the years. Like I've gone in different directions here, where trying to build something that creates the most agency for me personally was like the initial goal. Then it's sort of shifted to doing the work that I'm most proud of. And the idea that whenever you wake up and you're just like, oh man, I wish I didn't book that thing, or I wish I wasn't doing that, didn't have this thing to do today. That's like when you're on the downward slope. And it's as simple as that. Every time you open your eyes, like, am I looking forward to this? And, there are moments in time where you're doing something difficult in service of a greater goal, for sure. But just the easiest metric to keep track of is like, am I excited to go sit at my computer or do whatever it is I'm doing today?
Yeah, it's a blessing when you're able to do that.
Yeah.
Do you have any closing remarks or anything you want to share with the listenership?
We'll do the Snowpepen caption. Some light the fuse, some carry the torch. And I think everybody listening to this and this deep down the rabbit hole of this thing that sparked these conversations and these movements has a massive, massive ability to influence the direction of where this stuff goes. And, to even have the opportunity to talk to you guys about something that we're collectively passionate about, this is a far more interesting morning than I would have had 2, 3, 4 years ago in my career. So yeah, keep going.
Well, we're flattered, and thank you for such kind words. I know you are a steward of the space. I will say, for anybody listening, if you don't already, which I'll find it hard to believe, please follow Jack on X. He is at Jack Butcher, just one straight word, so to speak. But thank you for your time today. I know that your tentacles of influence are getting wider by the days, and the collaborations that you're working on with everything is impressive. I think it's only expanding the space, and similar to what you alluded to earlier with the discussions with Eric, it's absolutely necessary. And I applaud all of you for creating very attractive price points to allow people to collect around stuff and also have things that are unique and scarce. So I think you're doing amazing work. Thank you for your time today. For those who are listening, please feel free to follow SquiggleDAO on X. Also, like and repost this if you found the content valuable in any way. Join the SquiggleDAO Discord. There's a free section. If you're interested in making a big commitment to a Squiggle, individuals like Nifty are available to help talk you through the process and give you the confidence necessary for your purchase. We're looking to improve the content every day, so please feel free to drop a comment. And I will say, at least for Nifty and I, our DMs are open if you're interested in communicating whatsoever. So thank you for your time, Jack. Really, truly appreciate it.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Thanks for listening to the SquiggleDAO podcast, which has been brought to you by Niftify. Niftify is the pioneer of the entire NFT lending market. Their platform has the deepest liquidity, which usually means you can get the best terms. They also have no auto-liquidation risk. As long as you repay the loan before maturity, you get your asset back. Get more flexibility on your finances, take advantage of any opportunities, and make your NFTs work for you. Niftify has done over $500 million in total loan volume since launching in 2020 and has had over 60,000 loans with zero security incidents. Head to niftify.com and try lending today.
The information provided in this podcast is for general informational purposes only and should not be considered as professional or financial advice. The hosts and guests are not licensed financial advisors, accountants, or lawyers. The content is based on personal experiences, opinions, and research, and its accuracy, completeness, and timeliness cannot be guaranteed.